me to get out of here.
Good evening, listeners. Good evening, viewers. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third episode in the series Loss and Grief. Good to have you. I'm happy that we are able to continue on this discussion, loss and grief, a very important area of discussion. As we mentioned in our previous episode, everyone suffers some level of loss at some point in our sojourn. Welcome, Maxine. Maxine Ricketts is back with me on the platform as we discuss this matter. And we're going to go straight into our discussion. Hi, Maxine. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
Wonderful. My first question to Maxine is, well, in just to recap, last session we spoke about the types, with what we define grief, we define loss, and we also spoke a little about in terms of, for example, types of loss and categories of loss. Today we're going to look at the whole matter having to do with types of grieving. Maxine, would you like to share with us types of grief that persons experience?
Types of grief that has been identified in the field of mental health. Some of these have been described as complicated grief, anticipatory grief, delayed grief, disenfranchised grief, chronic grief, traumatic grief, distorted grief, cumulative grief, exaggerated grief, and mask grief. They sometimes overlap each other and can sometimes be a little difficult to identify the types of grief, and also it depends on the type of loss that one is experiencing that will determine how they're grieving. So for complicated grief, it's normally attached to something that it's normally connected rather with some great loss due to the attachment of that loss. And so a person who is experiencing complicated grief will not be able to move on from where they're at the time of loss. And so you'll find that they will always be grieving the loss and not able to cope well, not able to be resilient and return to life and move forward. Anticipatory grief, on the other hand, is where someone is grieving for a long period in expectation of a loss. So for someone with a family member who is sick, probably someone with a family member who has dementia, you're grieving a loss of that person even long before they have died, because they've lost their personhood. They're not able to interact. They've lost all connections and memory. And so for some family who have a loved one with dementia or Alzheimer, they're grieving the loss of that person even while they're still living. They might be very healthy and nothing wrong with them physically, but because they psychologically or mentally is not able to make connections, family grieve that loss. Disenfranchised grief, on the other hand, is where you have a loss, but socially you're not able to even demonstrate or get support for that loss. So let's say, for example, someone who dies by suicide, and there's a stigma to that in your community or in the society in which you are. You might not, the grieving family might not get as much support because of how the loved one was lost. They might not be able to grieve openly because it's just cliche. It's taboo rather. It's not accepted in that particular society. So that's disenfranchised grief. I'm not able to grieve. I'm not able to get the support because the society or the social setting in which I'm in does not accept that way of going, that way of dying. We also have chronic grief. So for someone who experienced loss after loss after loss, that's a lot of grieving over a period of time. Some of it might even be traumatic grief. You know, a child who has lost their childhood, loss of the parent, loss of a stable home, stable family, or someone who was physically or sexually abused, a loss of feeling secure and safe. That's a lot of grieving. You know, that's very traumatic for a lot of people, those who have witnessed a murder or seen something real traumatic happen. That can have a long-term effect on someone's mental health. Mass grief, a person who is grieving but not able to show it or demonstrate it, or if they might even be living in denial that they're grieving. So they're masking their grief and pretending that life is what it really isn't, that they've gotten over the loss and they're moving on. So that's some of the various types of griefs that we have.
Thank you so much. So, in fact, we do have types of grieving, and therefore, no type is common to any one person. Each person can experience different types of grief. As you heard earlier, it can be anticipatory grief, in anticipation of someone who is going through a chronic illness or is going through some kind of terminal condition. So you begin to grieve long in advance before the person actually passed. So there is in fact types of grieving that persons go through. Not to mention the disenfranchised grief, as I mentioned earlier too. There are times that you're in communities and stigmas are attached because of the condition under which a person lost or passed, lost his or her life or passed. So as we go through the series of grieving and the losing and experiencing loss, I just want to encourage you to identify if you're experiencing any of these and reach out for assistance. Reach out for someone who can help you because loss is not something that we encourage anyone to go through on his or her own. A support system is strongly recommended. Find persons who, and we're going to speak to that in future episodes. But at this point, we just want to encourage you to know that you're not alone. There is a voice, there is a hand waiting for you to be whole again, to experience wholesomeness. And that's why we focus on an oasis of wholesomeness where you can receive your healing. And that is important because, as we often say, that's the Lord's plan for our lives, to be whole, to live wholesome life. That's why he came. That's why he died. That's why he rose again, so that we can live lives of wholesomeness. We're going to look briefly, though, on the matter of this pandemic. A lot of persons have been affected through this pandemic. And we want to look briefly on how the pandemic has affected, or the impact of the pandemic, loss and grief. How do we look at the pandemic, the grief, the pandemic, the loss? And Maxine's going to speak about that in our next, in the next, as she speaks, she addresses that now, and as we look at that area.
Yeah, thank you. Everyone who is alive or who is cognizant and insightful can identify with the global events of the past 2 years as it relates to the pandemic. There are myriads of losses that we experience, and although each society is different and every environment is different, we can identify with sometimes all of them, or sometimes some of the different losses. And some of the types of losses that has been associated with the pandemic is loss of routine and predictability. So the way life used to be, we have lost the way we used to do things. We used to go to school, or we used to go to work this way, or we used to be able to do certain things. Now we can't do it this way. So routine has changed. It's a very unpredictable with what's going to happen. Now in the United States, they're saying you can stop wearing masks. There's no more mask mandate, but at the same time, they're telling you that the numbers are going back up. And I'm thinking, oh, that's a little bit off. It doesn't make much sense. Other types of loss of employment and income. A lot of people for the past 2 years was just really traumatic in terms of how they're going to survive. There are a lot of stories of people that go homeless here in the United States, and no doubt in Jamaica too. There were a lot of people who just don't know how they were going to make ends meet, take care of their children. A lot of churches had to close and go online. And then, as one person mentioned once, that affects church in a lot of ways, in that if you have a loan at the bank, you can't ask people to send their tithes to be able to make their loan payments. And so that was another loss of income in terms of for the churches. Loss of control. We just didn't have control over a lot of things that happened. We just couldn't help it. This virus was invisible. We couldn't see it. And a lot of how it works, what it does to us in our well-being couldn't be determined then. How the virus would affect us. So we just didn't know. It took time. Over time, the healthcare entities figured it out. Loss of future. A lot of people lost some things that would have happened, they anticipated would have happened in the future. Loss of physical activity, loss of entertainment or social life. A lot of people who lost loved ones couldn't even have a normal funeral. That's a big loss. That's something that is unheard of in our time, in our day and time, that you couldn't even go to your loved one's funeral. I've heard of people that have had to have virtual funerals because the funeral homes only hosted maybe 6 or 7 people, and that's hardly even your family members. Sometimes just the spouse and the children were allowed to attend those funerals. Lots of events and celebrations, graduations and weddings, all of that. Loss of health, loss of income, loss of friendships. And so if whichever society we're in, we can all identify with some of those loss. And of course, with the loss comes the grieving, the different types of grieving that we go through as it relates to the pandemic. And some people are still grieving because of those losses. Some people lost their jobs and never regained them. Some people become entrepreneurs and started businesses because they had to find a way to survive. They were very resilient. And so that was a positive outcome of that particular loss of income. So how do we cope with these losses as it relates to the pandemic? Just the same way we would cope with regular loss. We have to acknowledge it. We have to honor and validate the loss that took place. Realize that it's a genuine and it's a valid reason to grieve over these loss. Some people think, oh no, you don't need to grieve over it, but yeah, that's the way we're gonna get healing and move on. That's the way we're gonna get restored and renewed and be able to continue life. It might not be life as we know it, but it's because for the pandemic, they've said that this is the new normal. I'm sure it's a term that they use there in Jamaica. This is the new normal. This is how things are being done now. This is how we're gonna have to be. And so we're still navigating the pandemic, with the vaccines and all the different procedures, the social distancing and that sort of thing. We're getting better at it, but we're still navigating it. We haven't gotten out of it altogether. Now, how do we cope with these losses? Apart from acknowledging it or validating that there's a loss, We got to face the crisis that the pandemic brings upon us, right? We got to use our coping skills and coping mechanisms. Some people get very depressed as a result of the pandemic, especially those that have lost. We've heard of children that have lost both parents, and I can only imagine the trauma that those poor kids are going through. But we have to implement, we have to utilize what support systems we have. For those who have the spiritual support system of the church, that's a good way to garner support, to encourage us, to instill hope, and to remind us that in spite of what's happening, we're not hopeless. Um, for some people, their faith community, praying and meditating is what they use to cope. Um, for some people, they reach out. Social media just took off. If it wasn't taken off before, it took off even more during the pandemic, where now you have TikTok and several people maybe who wouldn't have gone out and done a TikTok video. Everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people do use TikTok for expression of freedom, and that is a way of liberating them and helping. I believe that's a good coping skill too, to be able to reach out to the broader community. So, your faith, doing relaxing things, doing self-care is very important. Self-care doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Self-care can just mean even going for a walk with a pet. I have a little dog, and she just had a litter in December. And every now and again, I just hug them. And for me, that just gives me such a thrill and help me to release stress, believe it or not. But, um, the different ways of coping, listening to music, writing, reading, dancing, doing art. Um, I don't have the benefit of the beach, but I really wish I did, because even just looking out at the sea can be therapeutic. So we can implement these various ways, creating a gratitude journal. That is something that has proven to be very effective. Just giving thanks, taking the time to recognize that even though we have experienced a lot of loss, there is something we can find to be thankful for. And that does a lot for us psychologically, giving thanks. And there's an old study that I did on expression of gratitude some time ago. So those are some of the aspects of the pandemic that faced us. We have a new normalcy. We have developed coping skills, believe it or not. It might not seem that way, but we have. We have learned to live with an invisible foe, and we have learned to survive. We have had some losses, and we're still grieving or have grieved, those losses. But we are determined to prove that our losses and the grieving process that we go through is not going to cause us to become crippled, or is not going to cause us to just throw in the towel and give up on life. We're still moving forward. Yeah. Coping with the losses during the pandemic, Uncertain Times, is an article written by Tammy Mixkey. She's a social worker. And I happened to review her article and wrote my own stint on it. And I think it was very, very good for me to go through that process, because it helped me to realize that a lot of the things that she has in her article I could identify with. And I'm able to benefit from her own research as well.
Wonderful. The recurring word, though, in when you speak about loss and grief, is hope. The
Hope,
Bible says,
yes,
if we are people with hope, without hope, we would be men most miserable.
for
And
sure.
wonderful. And it means that if we can just cling on to that word hope, we will get
Mhm.
through loss. And as a result, we'll be able to manage the grieving process. So I want to encourage us again. It's really an important thing not to brush aside or to look at it casually. when you are experiencing any kind of loss. It is a time to really analyze it and to see the impact it may be having on you. Our final point that Maxine is going to look at for us is grieving and depression. This is a major area, but before we end this episode, we do not want to go out without just briefly touching grieving and depression.
It almost goes without saying that if you're grieving, you're gonna be depressed. Depression has is a diagnosis, right? For the DSM-5. It's the diagnostic manual that is used to diagnose various mental health and physical
Disorders.
conditions.
Disorders.
So we're going to definitely be depressed. It's a sad mood. We're going to be down. You have clinical depression. You have different types of depression. But being sad, being gloomy, feeling hopeless, those are normal feelings for people who are grieving. Okay, the emotional effects, anxiety, feeling helpless, feeling numb, sometimes even feeling guilty too. Those are some of the symptoms of depression, and that is something that we'll definitely be going through if we are going through the grieving process and if we are experiencing depression. We can cope with it. We can learn coping skills and take it to another level so we can move forward and sometimes learn from it too. And as Christians, we know that the Holy Spirit comforts us, not just for our own sake, but so we can in turn become comforters for someone else.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you. Thank you, listeners. We have come to the end of another episode. Closing word, Maxine, on this episode.
I thank you very much for the opportunity to sit down and reflect a little bit on this important topic that affects all of us, and trust that out of this, someone will benefit and learn that they're not alone.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank
there's
you
hope.
again. Thank you,
All right.
Maxine. Thank you, listeners. Thank you so much. Bless you. Have a wonderful afternoon, wonderful day, wonderful evening, depending on the time you have just listened.
Sure.